Good afternoon. My name is Suzanne Charles, and I'm a partner and co-founder at Root of Two, like the square root of two, so math jokes after lunch, everyone. By way of visual description, I am an African-American female of medium brown skin with salt and pepper gray hair that is currently pulled back into a bun, so super streaky. I am wearing a black, long structural, or dark blue, long structural dress, and I am very pleased to be here today to talk about technology and creative practice, where we're going to have an opportunity with artists, curators, activists, and others. I think we all wear many hats to really dive into this idea of what it means to try and create using technology as a medium, but also as a thing that we are actually actively questioning its role and function in society. And so without further ado, I'm gonna ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, and then we're gonna get started with today's discussion. But I wanna thank you, and I wanna thank West Staff for the opportunity to have this panel discussion. And for you that are visiting online into today's discussion, please make sure you're getting your comments into the chat and your questions into the chat as we go. So without further ado, Alice.
Hi, my name is Alice Yuan Zhang. I do my visual description first. I'm a media artist. I am Chinese American and have dark black hair, pulled back halfway, and I am wearing a long sleeve black shirt with green squiggles and a bright pink skirt. Yeah, I'm a media artist, and we can take it from there.
Hello. Hi, guys. My name is Wade Wallerstein. I'm the Associate Curator at Gray Area Foundation for the Arts in San Francisco. We're a nonprofit arts and technology space that works internationally, but mostly serves our local community in San Francisco. I'm a white man with red hair and glasses, with skin paler than Casper the Friendly Ghost. Super excited to be here with everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Salome Asega, pronouns she, her. I am a new media artist that makes work through a participatory design process, and I'm also the director of New Inc., the New Museum of Contemporary Arts Cultural Incubator that supports creative practitioners working across art design and technology. We help people launch ambitious projects and business ideas through professional development and mentorship.
Great, thank you so much. And again, my pronouns are she, her. So I'm gonna start with a very easy question, hopefully easy question for this afternoon, and ask you all to define a little bit about technology and how it enters your creative practice. So what your own definitions are, how you are working with it, how you kind of came to it. I'm really curious how you're sort of defining it in ways that matter and make sense to you. Who would like to start?
So I am the niece of many computer scientist uncles who, for fun, encouraged me to take apart computers and put them back together. I don't know whose idea of playtime that was, not safe, but that was mine. And so I think very early on I had a kind of open door to this world of technology, and one of my uncles used to make video games as part of his computer science degree and send them to me on floppy disk and have me play test them to see what worked and what didn't. And that for me very early on built a bridge between storytelling, art, and technology. And then I think I did my MFA at Parsons in design and technology, and it was there where I really the door was fully bust open, and I saw this incredible candy land of people playing with physical computing tools, VR. My first headset I ever put on was in that program. And I think it was through the university that I was why don't other people know this? So I became this person that would take things from the workshop and bring them to my neighborhood and partner with community organizations. And that's how I developed my participatory practice.
It's helpful. Wade?
Oh gosh, where do I even begin? I feel like this is my whole life. So how do you delineate? So my training is not in art history, it's as an anthropologist, specifically how human beings relate to digital technologies. Since from my studies till now, I've been fascinated with the ways that digital technology and culture overlap, commingle, and affect one another. my parts in my role at Gray Area, I work with artists working with every kind of technology you can imagine, from digital technology to analog technology and everything in between. But my specialty is in simulation-based practice. So artists who are using game engines and other software-based methods to create artworks and simulate something. What I've found is that oftentimes when new tools are created, we don't completely understand their impacts or their implications. And artists are always at the front lines, testing things first, trying things for the first time, using things in the wrong way, and thus really revealing to us where innovation is taking us. And so that's why I find this work really important.
I am accidentally working with technology, or have been since, especially the onset of the pandemic, when I felt very stuck and started getting more interested in augmented reality, to kind of bring in spatial, imagination, and kind of then eventually explored more of the potential of that medium, and just also 3D immersive media for cultural storytelling, interspecies relations, also a sort of choreography that involves. At the same time, I was co-organizing a very amorphous collective or network of creative practitioners that all felt stuck at home, and it's called Virtual Care Lab. And so for the first 2 years of the pandemic, we met up like every week, in addition to various gatherings and networked explorations with each other, as Wade said, kind of using tools in all the wrong ways, and then making our own tools and exploring open source, etc. And now I am have become more and more critical of technology. I think the deeper I dig, the more I question its roots and constructs, its materiality, the energy use, how it shapes society, how we design technology, and how it designs us back. Or to be more specific, there are certain groups of folks who are more in the driver's seat for defining and designing technology, and then the way that it, impacts society at large, and creatives as well.
That's great. I want to kind of pick up on that thread that all of us, I think, have been working in around how we're sort of bringing our networks alongside us, like when we're thinking about how we're interrogating technology, both consciously using it, building tools, but then also really that kind of fundamental work to go, is this what we want? Can we actually have something preferable and better, and really relocate agency away from the way that technology and innovation currently are commingled? So I wonder, how do you think about that work to bring people alongside what can be like really daunting, complicated processes? Salome, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I guess when I hear that question, I think of there's like a one-page text written in 1969 by poet Amiri Baraka called Technology and Ethos, where he says very clearly, machines are an extension of man, or whoever created the machine. And he does this like very eloquently and like humorously through like deconstructing the design of a typewriter. And he says like, how boring, like that I write like stories through my fingertips. Like that is my only mode of creative expression on a typewriter. Like what if I wanted to dance out a story? Like why does it have to be this way? And what I love about that text is that it like really questions like who designs and what design is. And so for me in my practice, I think it's about revealing that everything around us was made by someone. Like there was a decision-making process. And so I guess like how I bring people along or make with others is through usually like a workshop modality that like prompts people to think about the technology that they currently have access to and the technology that they actually need in their communities or for themselves, and like prompt them to actually design that, like which feels like weirdly risky for them, but it's like there's nothing to lose. Let's just put it down on paper.
Yeah, that's great.
I really resonate with that a lot, Salome, for a lot of reasons. And I think, one thing, especially when trying to talk about this with someone who's maybe like quote unquote uninitiated or doesn't think that they know a lot about technology, is I think a lot about like the desktop, like why when we open your computer is it totally coded to white collar labor with files and recycling bin and all of these different conventions. And so that's usually a place that I start with people. Like let's like take a step back and actually look at what we're using. Why is it set up this way? How does this make you feel? Do you feel happy using this device or sad? And everything in between. And I find that people, technology is something that's so integrated into all of our lives that we either, if we don't have direct experience with, we have some kind of mythos around through like science fiction or movies or anything like that. And so I always think that taking a step back, really examining what is this, why are we using this, those questions that you kind of like brought up at the beginning, is a really helpful place to start. Because often, tools are things that are integrated into our lives in a thoughtless or unconscious way. And it is worth, pausing and like actually looking at what's in our hands. And I know that this is something that like we're all starting to think about more and more as like critical mineral resources become a much more pressing, topic of conversation, and also a point to speak to public policy in a lot of governments, fiscal and policies today. So yeah.
And I think that's a perfect segue to talk about the way that you come to understand the materiality of technology. Maybe you can share a little bit more about that.
Well, I wanted to bring in a quote that I love from our favorite science fiction writer, Ursula Le Guin, who has a little piece called A Rant About Technology, because she's so often framed as like not a hard science fiction writer. And she gets put in the basket of soft tech. And she talks about, or her definition for technology is that it is merely the active human interface with the material world. So if we think about the history of how we've interfaced with the material world, we have done that in so many ways. We have done that, since the day that we have become humans. And then, I think if we think about the way that technology is made and how it interfaces with the active, with the material world to date and currently, it is a very scary situation that we find ourselves in. I could go in depth to, consider, of course, the cobalt, the tungsten, all of the, the conflict minerals. We could talk about, electricity and the use of massive use of electricity with data centers, right? And also not just operational carbon emissions, but the embodied carbon emissions of making all of these devices and whatnot, all of the planned obsolescence, how long these things last for. But I think maybe one metaphor that I think about, going back to what Ursula talks about also as a basket as a technology, I think about, the lifespan of a basket versus the lifespan of a phone, let's say. A lifespan decomposes, in a couple years when you're done using it, or you might, hold on to it for a while and pass it down, but it'll decompose if you let it. And if we think about the history of a basket, we've had baskets in civilization for so long, and the recipe for how to make a basket still lasts to this day. If we think about, how much it takes to build up a phone or a computer, we're talking about millions of years worth of stuff that is digged up from underground, and, electricity that comes from fossil fuels. 60% of electricity still comes from fossil fuels in this country. On the other hand, in contrast, a phone's lifespan is only a couple years by design.
Yeah, so it sort of brings to mind this idea of who does this ephemeralization of like technology serve, right? Like the degree to which we're asked to not really consider deeply the sort of consequential trains, whether that be of supply chains or otherwise coming from technology, from the mineral use, to also the way that we're thinking about the production of it. It's like there's a big question of who does that serve that invisibilization in terms of making us feel passive, making us feel like we don't have agency. So I wonder, Maybe my mic is not working. Maybe
Hello?
here.
Hello?
Hello. Hello. Oh gosh, did we say something wrong?
Technology is defying
What
us.
do we do? I don't know. Well, you guys can hear us, so hopefully folks online will be able to hear us if we keep talking at a slightly louder clip. Okay. Well,
Someone says they can.
Oh, they can hear us.
okay. People online say they can hear us fine, so we're gonna roll with that, I guess. Okay. We have no idea. We promise we did not do anything wrong if you're listening. Echelon, echelon, echelon. Okay, so having said that, we were talking a little bit about this idea of like, who does that serve, this notion that like we're kept at a distance from feeling like we have agency over technology or agency over its understanding in society. So I wonder, Wade, if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think, there is this real sort of consequence of where simulation can really help bring people into that conversation.
Absolutely, and I think that it always kind of comes back at its core to just education in general. Like, how are we relating to the users of technology, the creators, the artists who are creating with technology, but also talking about media literacy. Like, what do the outputs of what we're making with this technology mean in a broader culture? How do I navigate this or even read this? How is this legible to me? And a lot of times, I think that that's a starting place that we kind of have to begin with. But often, when in talking about education, that's something that we do at Gray Area. We teach all different kinds of technology and arts-related courses, from creative coding to artist SEO for your website, like a business tech skill, and everything in between, all the way to AI, tech, and ethics on the more philosophical side. And oftentimes, people don't realize that they have been having these conversations for years over the dinner table, that they know how to do these things that they thought were really complicated, that some kind of terminal interface or code-based interface prevented them from accessing. It blows their minds when they realize, oh my God, like I can make a 3D modeled object. I can, write a simple algorithm. It's not, as scary as I think it appears to be. And that, to me, is a really awesome place to start. Like, I love, this is such a corny example, but I love these, like, color block games that are, like, coding for kids. I think that those are so fabulous and so amazing and, show that this is not some, like, esoteric, erudite thing. Like, somebody made it, you can do it too. And building confidence and literacy with these tools is really, like, the foundation of all of that.
Go ahead.
So I've been teaching a class at the School for Poetic Computation called Solidarity Infrastructures, which is really just a class for me to learn about ideas that everyone has for how to rethink technology, but also beyond that, like why we need to do anything that we might look to the current tools for. So why do we communicate, and how else do we want to do that? How do we network? How do we organize? How do we feel more connected, and so on. So I think, we just wrapped up our second round of class alongside, the class showcase, projects, and reflections. And a lot of folks were like, this is such a composting class. It's such an unlearning kind of process that just goes back more deeply to why do we do the things that we do, and how else can we do it? And so, there are so many other ways to think about, reclaiming agency, like you said, and very important gestures toward that we can make as artists. So, alternative networks, mesh networks, decentralized networks and protocols, radio as another way of communicating that has a lot of history and activism and community voices, minority languages being represented. Other things that pull from permaculture principles. There's kind of a newer movement happening around permacomputing. There are just so many ideas.
I want to pick up on this idea of like becoming the tool maker. And I think, that sort of early association for me of even like being encouraged to like learn to code in order to like make my first game. So it's like I couldn't even play the game unless I like learned to code it first, right? I think that there is that sort of sense of like curiosity and experimentation. But when that sort of scales up as part of your artist practice, how do you navigate the challenges of having to be like the tool maker as part of that, as being the person who is making the technology, and then having to think through disseminating it and all of those kind of complications, especially from an artist lens and especially from the way that artists are often typically funded and resourced to do that work. Dive in, anyone.
I can just quickly follow up on that, thinking about, how so often artists are seen as individuals or lone geniuses, and as well as innovators in the technology fields. The idea just comes from somebody in their college bedroom, and suddenly we all abide by it. But, from more of the solidarity infrastructure standpoint, or, if we think about this longstanding also practice of community technology, there are so many ways to do it together, to do it with others. And one of the things we practice in class is server hosting. And so, that's very much just a beginner kind of practice of trying to reclaim our data, trying to think about also, the pathway that usually our data might run through, how far it travels to go to a Google data center, just to be able to get to your friend next to you, to send a photo or whatever it is. And how can we, and also more serious implications of that, right? If you're doing activist work or, many other kinds of projects, how does it feel to have your data in that kind of black box somewhere else, and how can we kind of ask for more transparency or even collectively hold that by upskilling a bit on how we manage our data, how we host our own tools. And that's very much a collective practice. I mean, I think we can talk about being stewards, and not everyone needs to learn those tools, but also thinking about sharing and the terms and the processes of using technology together and being a conversation.
Yeah. Salome, I want to bring you into this as well.
Yeah, I mean, you said exactly what I would have said, that like most of the tools that I use in my practice, and I'm sure many of like our collaborators use, are open source tools that were built by artists, right? And so when I think about like one of the first games I ever made was using a hacked Connect and like all the libraries and like GitHub repositories that like allowed me to make that game were developed by other artists, right? Or even after that, like Open Frameworks was a language developed by artists, right? And now like a language I use all the time is P5.js, which is stewarded again by artists. So like we are never doing this work alone, but we are building the infrastructure that we all need to continue doing our work.
And just to follow up on that, I think that to me in this conversation, the biggest issue is artist access to infrastructure. Like Salome said, like artists are having to build it themselves because no one is doing it for them and nobody's offering it to them or giving them access to it. Like in terms of like artists setting up their own servers, like I'm really inspired by that work because so many of the tools for agency and ownership and authorship are abstracted. They exist in some corporate cloud, and you end up going through a service or through multiple intermediaries to access your own materials, your own artwork files, for instance. So I'm really inspired right now by projects that are using like decentralized server systems and like teaching artists how to set up their own nodes in their studios so that they can, as Alice said, steward and manage their own data. But there really just isn't a lot of like open infrastructure that can just be utilized, and it's again why the open source movement is so important.
Yeah. And I want to I think that that's a natural segue to something else we were discussing, which is like, what does it mean to actually try and partner with some of these tech companies, and sort of that relationship that you end up having to forge around like getting access to the infrastructures you need, and like what the trade-offs are when you sort of enter into those relationships. So maybe Wade, do you want to kick us off and get started with that a little bit, and then
Yeah,
we'll go
sure.
from there?
I've definitely worked with different tech companies in different capacities and at different scales to partner. And, you know, like for instance, I don't want to say anything negative out of turn. But what I will say is that as soon as you enter into any kind of partnership or relationship like that, it's rare. Oftentimes, there are some companies who understand that like radical usage of their tool is positive, and they want you to just like go crazy and do whatever you want to do, and that's amazing. And any companies out there who are doing that, thank you on behalf of all of the artists who are benefiting from that. But oftentimes, caught up in a capitalist hype cycle, use of technology for artists is to demonstrate a particular feature, and it's really used as an advertising tool in very direct ways. And so that really limits the scope of creativity. Often artists, whenever they enter these kinds of relationships, are always censored 100% of the time. And yet it is important nonetheless. Often one partner that I love working with is Epson, who at Great Area very many times over the years will donate projectors to us. And that's a really great partnership because it's hardware. There's not a lot of ways that we can use that technology in a bad way or in a way that they wouldn't be happy with. We're showing off the capabilities of their tools, and we're getting access to $100,000 equipment and showcasing it to the best of its ability, things that no artist that I work with would ever be able to afford or use in their own studio. And so that's just a really amazing way that us as a nonprofit, the artists in our community, and then this business are all benefiting in a really, I think, positive way for everyone.
I wonder if we can also touch on this idea of the intersection of sort of technology and within our field, the arts, broadly speaking. I think we've all grappled at different times with the idea that we're too tech to be in the arts and we're too art to be in tech. And now we've actually seen a kind of real rise and real moment of both anxiety and optimism around the role that technology can play in the arts. So I wonder, how are you navigating this upward curve right now, even though we know that this has been a kind of cycle that has been perpetuated for a long time? But how you feel about that kind of organizational partnership possibility?
I mean, I feel really hopeful. I mean, one thing I'm going to say about our nebulous field of art and technology is that we defy definition in this really cheeky way that's I love us. Before I worked at the New Museum, I worked at the Ford Foundation, where I partnered with the NEA and Knight Foundation on a report called Tech is Art. And in the appendix of that report, there's a list of over 100 terms for what artists working in this space would call themselves. And I was like, why are we like this? But I love us, So for me, it's there's still the challenge of articulation because technology develops at a speed that is it's so quick, right? And so how do we educate maybe more traditional arts organizations and bring them along, and then also maybe on our side slow down a bit and do some of that, have some of those conversations.
Well, and also without great cost to the organization. I know a lot of folks working in a museum-specific settings who can't make the change because at that speed because of the cost it incurs. How many museums made apps or custom websites 10 years ago, which are now totally defunct? They spent millions, and for what? And so I find that to be a big barrier too.
Yeah, it seems like there needs to be a bit of a lightness, and maybe that's a role that artists can play. I'm curious to what you were going to respond with as well, Alice.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about your previous question too of tech companies and our relationship there. I think I'm generally wary of the relationships that artists are in a way incentivized or mandated to have with both tech companies as well as cultural institutions, and also this kind of, is it a revolving door or some sort of one follows the other? I mean, tech companies, I feel are often, or there's tech companies, but then there's also just things that come up, right? New things that come up. And these kind of eras then define what the prompts are from the cultural institutions, which then define what the prompts are for artists, which is an uncomfortable way for artists to work. I think that limits the amount of independent thought and experimentation that could happen. And I just wonder, what kind of society could we have if artists can be the ones to start with, like, hey, this is what technology is. Hey, maybe this is what we need. Maybe this is what we don't need. And how can we incentivize, like, we know that there are policymakers and, grants makers in the room as well. And how can we kind of, allow for more of that dissent and more of the kind of co-creation to really be, led by an artist, earlier in the process.
Yeah, I want to kind of stick on that then and go, let's build that out. What would that take, right? Like if we wanted to just sort of arbitrarily today decide that all of our movements around technology are going to be artist-led or culture-led first, right? Rather than innovation company-led or government incentive-led through our sort of science and tech apparatus. What would that look like? Like, what would you need? What kind of convenings would you need? What kind of networks would you need? What kind of funding would you need? Like,
More funding for basic needs for people to be able to access healthcare and to access housing. I'm coming from LA, where a lot of that is just impossible and getting worse and worse for artists. And the only ones who can really hang on are folks who have some sort of, resources from multiple jobs or from family or whatever it is. But also more meals, more hangouts that are not laden with immediate demands of metrics, expectations, and kind of showing, monetary results or kind of pushing for the next product that a tech company wants out there. And I think a lot of community work and cultural work, in actuality, takes time and takes cohesion and repetition. I think with Virtual Care Lab, what we saw was some of the most valuable things that came out of it, and the meaning-making moments that really came out of it was relationships being built over time with our weekly Sunday conversations or just kind of off-the-cuff conversations, and many, 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 many of those. Can we have the luxury to do that?
other thoughts?
I mean, I live in a city where the library is no longer open 7 days a week, right? And I think that these are the kind of like formative nodes in our culture that help us shape the world we want to live in, right? And so 10 years ago, with a group of artists, founded what we called a digital art collaboratory called Power Plant, based in Bushwick, where we'd hire mid-career established media artists to teach workshops to the next generation of creators. And it was at that kind of like local engagement level, right? Like that we found like we were making meaningful impact. And I can't remember who said it in the first panel, but like what people are learning in middle school, high school is not, the kind of media technical training at that level is not matching what's happening in our outside of the schools, outside of the walls of the school. And so I don't know. I feel like that's where impact would be made, is at that level.
I think, part of what makes relationships between artists and companies problematic or difficult is kind of like the bottom line to a stakeholder. Like, companies are so afraid to let artists do whatever they want with their technology because they're afraid of bad PR coming out the other end, stock value going down when people lose confidence. And so part of it is something that like every person can be a part of, like changing our culture so that those kinds of like accepting moments of failure, accepting moments of breaking or of reconfiguring as, a necessary and an important part of like what it means to exist in a technological ecosystem. That's I don't know what it would take to make that kind of cultural shift, but I'm hoping that we will see more of it. I know that in thinking about open source and different things like that, that's something that younger generations are way more used to. Like if you think about TikTok remix culture, it's so okay to steal someone's content, make a new video, reframe it, do your own thing. Remix and reuse is a part of how young people are growing up and how they're consuming media and relating to each other. So it kind of goes on that in the future, they will understand why this kind of knowledge sharing is valuable, and they will there will be, they will really understand and value that value.
Yeah, we also talked a lot about this idea that for most of us, because we have had to be both the curator and the practitioner and the organizer, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it means to try and navigate those modalities, and then like what's beautiful about that work, but also what is challenging and very distinct in some ways from your other peer artists, right? Like who, for better or for worse, might have an ecosystem that knows how to come up and support them in different ways.
I'm curious to hear from you as someone who's an artist, an educator. You steward a program, the Virtual Care Lab.
I feel like in this society, time is so expensive, and that's the main issue. Like, good ideas take time, good relationships take time. And increasingly, it feels like we have less and less time to do all of that. And I have such a complex relationship with this, need for artists to provide care and to be the caretakers of ourselves, of each other, of society at large. It's a lot to ask. And I think it takes a toll, burnout is real. And I think also a lot of the really heartfelt work is not necessarily the work that might be the shiniest for, grants funding or, and I suppose maybe we can have more workshops of, how to make that case on both sides, to make that more seen and recognized for its importance. But, I think as we talk about technology and innovation and societal progress, I think we should also remember that there are the basic tenets and foundations of like, what is community and what are relationships and what is culture that I think we all have answers to, in the room and in the audience. And those are some things that increasingly, not just artists, but just, folks at large are struggling to be able to access. I think in the previous panel, someone was talking about, the benefits of arts and culture to society at large. That's something that everyone can hold and that artists can be facilitators of and can plant those seeds. But, it takes making time less expensive, perhaps, for us all to be, for that to be more accessible.
Yeah, and I think that, just speaking to that, I think that like a desire for product or output or end result, like that's really the emphasis of so many of these kinds of relationships or kinds of expectations. Like people don't hire an artist because they care about the 6 weeks of brushstrokes it takes them to make a painting. They care about the painting kind of thing. And there is so much more that goes into any work of art, any exhibition, any talk, any public program. And I agree. I think that the immediacy and not only the speed and the immediacy, but also the expectation of like some kind of defined output does limit, or it places the emphasis on the wrong part of the process and where the value is really coming from.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add also on that point that I think a lot of what we see in particular in the US's ecosystem of art and tech is very product oriented. It's very like, make a piece of content that we can call art, or make a story, make, something that we can ship as like, oh, this just came out on VR. Or this is like a theater piece that is launching here and is going to get this many people in an audience. But I also spent some time, in other regions of the world, kind of getting deeper into tech infrastructure and creative practice, and maybe what we could call socially engaged media arts. And I feel like there is so much more funding attention toward infrastructural practice in certain areas in Europe that I felt really inspired by, that I really am just kind of here making a wish for that at home, and thinking about like, it's dire time for us to no longer ignore all of the complexities of what it means to work with technology, to work with media, and how can we kind of incentivize not just whatever next new thing is going to come out with whatever next media we deem to be emerging, but also this criticality and experimentation around the tools, around the infrastructure. How do we support those open source projects? How do we support, community infrastructure practices?
There's also, in that Tech is Art report, there were many artists who were interviewed who said that they wore many hats intentionally as a way to ensure that they had continued access to resources. And so there are many artists who teach in universities because so many of like the new tech, so much of the new tech is like, the universities have the resources to purchase them, and they could continue kind of iterating on their practice in that space. Yeah.
Totally. And I also think that these are all problems that are not going to become easier to solve as tech advances. Like, systems are becoming more complex. They're becoming more illegible. We have new agents in the ecosystem, artificial intelligence agents, reinforcement learning agents, are making, this is just becoming more and more complicated. And so if we don't shift how we think about these things now, I think that it's going to be bad news bears.
Definitely. And I also feel like there's this other part of it, which is like the other hat many of us have to wear is around this kind of contextualization, dissemination, whether we're publishing or writing or zining, and doing it in ways that sort of border on sort of popular education, right? In order to make sure that we're sort of, giving people roots into the work, right? And so I wonder from that point of view, everybody here has a bit of a writing or publishing practice in terms of how they talk about it. So could you talk a little bit about what it means to try and keep those platforms alive as well, even as we've seen criticality in other sections of the art really diminish?
This is a little bit of an off-topic example, but I think it relates. I really firmly believe that you have to meet people where they're at, and I think that that's really important to do. And I think that we can't just sit in ivory towers and write great academic, thoughts and just have them exist there and that's it. I think that we have to go, where people are, and an exhibition that really has shaped a lot of the way that I think about this was a show by Turbo Avedon, and it was in Fortnite Creative. Fortnite is a massively multiplayer online game that a lot of kids play, but people of all ages around the world. And this exhibition was viewed or visited by over 1 million players. Over 1 million players came and saw this very esoteric, very opaque, critical media performance practice unfolding in their game space. But 1 million people saw it. And I say this all the time, I could curate the biggest show at the biggest museum in the world and I would never get 1 million eyeballs on it. It's just not realistically possible. And so I think that whenever I'm thinking about going to write something or trying to approach a new topic or idea, I really feel like it's important to go where people are around that. If we're talking about the metaverse, we have to go to Fortnite, we have to go to Roblox. These might be kids' games, but that's where people are. And I think that using colloquial vernacular in that sense that's not a colloquial term at all, but I think that it's super important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think following that thread, last year at New Ink, many of our members were interested in decentralization, Web3, the next phase of the internet, and we were thinking about ways we could disseminate some of the ideas coming out of our program. And so naturally, we threw a punk show. So we threw a punk concert in Times Square, and we disseminated a zine that commissioned essays by writers and artists, musicians who were thinking about punk subculture as a precursor for what we're seeing now with decentralization. And I think that really speaks to meeting people where they are and finding new forms that are just as expressive as the technology projects we support.
Because if we're talking about, for instance, in thinking about technology, technology isn't just made in a shiny chrome Silicon Valley office. Oftentimes it's cobbled together in a basement or in a living room or done by someone that isn't a male white collar worker. And so being more open and going to where these things are happening or where the excitement is, I think is super key.
Yeah, I love writing as a medium to figure out and to articulate and amplify like why I do the things I do, or what I am seeing in the milieu of our technological ecosystem and whatnot, and what else might be possible. And I feel like increasingly artists step into, or maybe are called to go into this position of being theorists as well. Really, I feel like writing is, I've come into it as more of this direct way to articulate what we need, and then that feeds back into conversations and other work in other forms.
I also am very curious if we think about sort of building out this notion of like, writing and sort of appropriating or the use of sort of other forms of the arts that sort of give us that kind of route into kind of publicness for the work. Is there anything that you feel completely challenged by in trying to sort of navigate sort of technology with diverse audiences and publics? Like, what is the hard thing that you end up having to do? Maybe it's never hard, but I always feel like there's something
hard.
Okay, all right. I know that there's a hard thing.
Well, here's one thing, something that I've been struggling with recently. Like the things that like you go and you see and you're like, wow, this is amazing and it seems so seamless, are generally very complicated problems or situations. And there are so, like, very simple things are very hard to do often. A great example being multi-channel video display. If you want to show more than 5 channels of video at once, like, there is really like one hardware solution. You have to buy not like a different device for every screen. Each one comes at like a $300 cost, and that's the only viable commercial option that exists right now. And so this is like, it's a really, you would think it would be so easy. I just want to play 6 videos at the same time and I want them to all be in sync. Like, shouldn't that be easy? Shouldn't there be like an app for that? There isn't. And so I also think that like there is a great, so in terms of what I find hard, I find that like actual needs are not being catered to in a way that is accessible, user-friendly, or even just like available point blank period. Like, that you can open up any kind of Adobe program and you can do a billion things, but usually, like, if anybody who uses Photoshop here knows that like the way that you know how to do something, there's probably an easier way that somebody else knows, but you don't know. And I find, and why is that the case? Why aren't we starting from the simplest, And I think that that's a huge problem that speaks to I'm sure that both Alice and Salome at any level can relate to that, because it can be challenging.
What else is hard?
I think artists are social creatures, and what I found really hard in the last couple years has been the closure of spaces where we gather. And I'm just thinking of Naval, which has been a really foundational, amazing experimental space in LA that just closed their physical space recently, and is, one of many that has really casualties that has hit our environment in LA. And I think, I wish for more of that maintenance to be possible, and for strange ideas and really groundbreaking ideas to have the space to live, and for folks to be able to have conversation and that sort of liveliness more often. So I think that's what I personally find hard in the current moment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There have been many, many spaces that closed their doors during the pandemic, unfortunately. We also lost many of our festivals or conferences, which were like, kind of annual meeting points that like I relied on to like see people, especially nationally. New Ink launched a festival called Demo last year, hoping to fill some of that void. I know you were there last year. But that's happening. It happens every June if you're in New York. It's also live streamed. But there's also Gray Area Festival, which takes place
September this year.
Okay, so we got the seasons covered. But But then I also think access to resources is like huge. So one space in New York that has become like a kind of haven for our community is Onassis Onyx, which is a space in Midtown Manhattan that was co-founded by the New Museum and Onassis Foundation, and it's an extended realities development and production studio, and it has the latest and greatest fun toys to play with, including like a full motion capture studio. It's one of 4 motion capture studios in the city, the others being kind of gate-kept behind academic institutions or large commercial studios. So it's like by far the most accessible studio for artists. And this is, I'm trying to remember who said it earlier about, you were talking about the arts organizations creating their own apps during the pandemic. Like this to me is like an interesting, Onassis Onyx is an interesting like case study for like what happens if we like build collective like equipment lockers for organizations that we all buy into, right? That it's like a cooperative structure. So, I mean, it's only now 3 years old, but I think there's gonna be soon a lot of learning to pull from it.
We have a program at Gray Area. It's called the Grand Creative Resources Library, and it's a lending library for like all different kinds of audio equipment, modular synthesizers, all of the kind of nerdy AV stuff that like you've never even heard of. You can get for free, and that's kind of like a fiscally sponsored project that's located within our physical space, and it's amazing and it's super underutilized. And I think that like not only do we need more of these spaces, but we need to find ways to tell people that these things are here and get them out the door. I'm always really inspired by the Toronto Public Library System and what they've been able to do with lending. They lend out mobile Wi-Fi hotspots for free to community members to make sure that people have bandwidth. And I think going back to challenges, it's the challenge is getting people to really understand and feel the impact of these tools as necessary, critical infrastructure, and in a lot of cases, public good. Is it like, it kind of sounds silly to say out loud, but like why at this point, Wi-Fi kind of is a public good. Everybody needs it. Everybody needs connection in order to participate fully in our society. Whether that's good or bad, it's a reality that, we have to start addressing in that mode.
Yeah, these spaces are, as you mentioned, like so important for sharing equipment, tool libraries and whatnot, but they also are spaces where folks are experimenting with new economic models. They're, spaces for experimenting with, labor and the value of labor collectively, with maintenance and repair, with, time banking and all of these models that, we would be curious to see out in the broader world. But these art spaces are where they happen. So that's also another.
One other challenge that I really want to touch on, because I think it's important for this conversation, and this is like the largest frustration that I have, is valuation of born digital artworks and art and the products of these conversations of art and technology, right? The market just is not there to support this kind of practice. People are not buying it. Like there's this kind of conception that because it was made on a computer that it requires less craft or it's less valuable than a sculpture or a painting or something plastic and material that you can decorate your home with. There are one of the big, I've worked, in addition to my nonprofit work, I've worked in commercial galleries and, experienced this very firsthand. And, people don't, you look at a file-based artwork and people don't even know how to display that in their homes. They don't know how to live with it. And so if we understand these intersections of art and technology to be of critical importance for our society, then we also need to think more critically about what it means to live with this kind of work. How is an image and I think that AI is a great example, right? Like how does an image produced from a learning algorithm impact the way I think about what it's depicting? Like how is this, it always comes back to like, what is this doing to our culture and why? And kind of flows up from there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, we obviously touched on this kind of conversation of like digital equity, and I think, when we think fully about equity and we think about the economic models underpinning whether it's the works that are created through art and technology, or if we're actually thinking about the kind of preconditions of place that we have been kind of circulating in our conversation. We're talking about health and well-being, we're talking about access to affordable housing, all of these things that we sort of think of as the social safety nets that we want not just for artists, but for everyone, right? We come to this kind of thing where it's like, are all of the artists we're talking about fully digitally included? And if they're fully digitally included, are they fully digitally confident, right? And I think this is where I find the new sort of models of philanthropy entering this conversation around technology and arts are really trying to make that technology as widely applicable to all artists. So it's not just the traditional maybe route through that most of us took, but it's kind of like, I trained as a painter and now I have to grapple with this question of what technology and art means to me. So I wonder how you feel about, the solidarity that can maybe exist now between artists who were not trained in art and technology, don't think of themselves in art and technology, but are trying to grapple with that as part of their practice, and kind of what are the networks we might bring together if we're sort of forging those new relationships.
So what we saw with the virtual care lab community that was, always shape-shifting and growing, was that most of the folks that came through were not media artists or didn't have tech backgrounds. They were just creative practitioners of various avenues who were curious, and also folks who are situated in different locales, especially folks who are in more rural areas or who had accessibility needs that were so often not met by physical spaces. And so, that was kind of this hub for folks to be able to explore with, we did sound walks, we did, virtual tango, which kind of worked. We did many different kinds of poetic experiments and collective meal times even online. And it wasn't really about the technology, but at the same time, it illuminated what the technology could do, or what was not there, and kind of also those hybrid spaces as their own thing, which was interesting to us, feeling out the textures of that. And we also had a sort of open residency series of conversations called Terms That Serve Us, in which we, invert terms of service to really define what this experience and, terms of being together could be. And so I think it's very necessary and it's refreshing for creative practitioners at large to think about technology. Technology is not only a question reserved for artists who, identify purely in their practice with working with technology, or media artists per se, but really is a public question.
Yeah, I'm thinking in our New Ink ecosystem, there are many artists who, when it comes to time to apply to a program or a fellowship or residency opportunity, and they have to discipline themselves, it's a challenge, And so, internally we've talked about how maybe useless disciplines are becoming, and there are a lot of people in our program who identify as anti-disciplinarian. And then I recently met with an arts organization in New York that had a kind of prominent tech fellowship program. It came with studio space, ample resources, and they've dissolved it. They've decided, as a test, they don't want to separate artists working with technology, and they actually just want to integrate that work into their larger residency program, because they feel like what artist right now isn't working with technology. And I think that's interesting, and I want to watch that, because I think that'll do more good than the harm that I feel like artists feel like it's doing right now. I think that is actually a good move.
So I want to give time to our audience to ask some questions. So I don't know if anyone has questions in our live audience, but also if you are online, please get your kind of questions into the chat. But I want to open it up now. I know I could keep asking them questions for days, but I'm really curious to see what our audience has for them. Thoughts? Maybe not a question, maybe a thought. We've got one.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Cynthia from West Staff. And I have a question. Earlier, I think it was Wade who talked a little bit about remix culture. And I'm curious to dig a little bit more into that, about general thoughts of benefits of remix culture and challenge of maybe, for lack of a better word, crediting or intellectual property or appropriation, that kind of thing.
Perfect.
It's a really good question, because it's a really sticky issue, because there are people creators, specifically artists who kind of fall on both ends of the spectrum, right? Like there's your super open source maxis who are like, this is amazing, anybody can do whatever they want with this is great, my creation is inspiring other people, and then they're making something new. And then there's people on the other end of the spectrum who feel exactly the opposite. They're like, my labor is already so exploited and my talent and time is so extracted that like, how dare you take something that I did and like cut me out of the deal, basically. So it's complicated, and it's something that like I find myself navigating all the time in my role. However, I think that like a lot of this is generational. A lot of this has to do with our legal systems and the ways that like copyright law works in different ways in various states that is kind of like programmed into us. You know, if we look to more ancient or traditional or indigenous forms of knowledge, different forms of creation, there was no ownership over like a produced image. And so this idea about ownership and copyright is very Western and very contemporary. Whether that's positive or negative, I'm not sure. And there are so many. What I think what's happening right now is the technology is kind of starting to catch up. Cryptographic technologies, blockchain technologies are allowing us to do different kinds of verifications and public verifications that we weren't able to do before. So therefore, if somebody does take your image and remixes it and reuses it, you've got a digital receipt that like they might have done whatever they did with it, but you've got the receipt right there. Like you can authenticate that and verify that, which is amazing. But I think this will continue to be a problem as our culture changes and as people start to understand remix and reuse more. Again, I think TikTok is the perfect example because I think it really goes to show how, you know, as this kind of culture grows and picks up steam and becomes more integrated into a more everyday user's life. Like I know, I keep using TikTok as an example, but so many people have learned how to do video editing on their phones because of TikTok, because of the tools that they make available to people, because of the CapCut, like extra app, all of these other things that people realize, oh, I can be a video editor. I can do this thing. Oh, that's super cool that somebody took my video and did this with it. And so I think that like, while this will never be like a totally black and white issue, I think that this will just continue to happen and become more accepted and more integrated into our daily online practices. I mean, how many of us haven't like reshared a meme ever? Like we've all, I promise you've done it whether you know it or not. And it's just becoming more and more a part of our day-to-day culture.
It also has like always been, right? I think of like hip hop and bootlegging, right? Or even like techno, right? I'm talking to somebody from Michigan, you know.
Yes.
But like the invention of techno is like, when I visited Detroit, one of the last times I met with Underground Resistance, and the lore I've heard about the invention of the sound in Detroit is that there was a period of time where people who could afford synthesizers at full cost were being banned from music venues. Bands were literally lobbying to get DJs out of venues because it was cheaper for a venue to hire a DJ than it was like a 4-person band, right? And so then people who could afford the equipment at full cost were starting to like pawn off their equipment, and that's when like a younger, more black generation of music makers scooped up the toys and invented a whole new sound that has traveled the world and back again. And so there is something interesting about like bootlegging or like remixing when there's like a power construct there that like shut you out in the first place, you know?
Yeah, and I actually think that that sort of spirit of punk that you talk about is endemic to so much of like what we think of as kind of art movements, right? They are both born of the thing that was trying to maybe like shut them down, but then they kind of owe part of their legacy to that. And so I do think that we've always been remixing, but I do think we have these constructs that make it like super hard when we think about intellectual property and the way that it's practiced, but then also having to argue for the value of creative labor, which we only get to express if we actually are expressing our IP, right? So it sort of creates this doubling that is really uncomfortable when we want to argue for more support and resources for artists.
Yeah. The first thing I thought of when you had asked that question was shanzhai, which is this morph in Chinese culture and also in art history, like has a lineage of, just copying even in traditional Chinese art history, like copying the masters and putting your stamp on it, and then someone else kind of copying and then putting their own stamp on it, and that was accepted as, even reverence for the work and its proliferation. And then to present day, when you have just like blatant copies of, name brand stuff that is all across the streets. And I think there's something, also very punk about that and very kind of irreverent. And then, at the same time, I think about like the power of licenses and just speaking something into existence. I mean, or copyleft licenses as a sort of like, use this, but not for commercial purposes. And I think as artists, we can collectively shape that ethos of what we want to happen with our own work and what we want to happen, in collective, producing and thinking processes, and call it what it is on our own terms.
We have another question.
Yeah, I'm just listening to, Julian Bleeker from Near Future Laboratory. I'm curious about your perspectives on that moment when blockchain, crypto, NFT, remember that? And like, because it felt like the excitement and enthusiasm for creative practice had this 12-second renaissance where it seemed like something new was happening, and there was all this promise and evolution. And I don't want to, criticize it one way or the other, but just in those 12 seconds, what was your experiences as cultural producers, as individual artists, as kind of curators of communities of practice? What were you feeling then? And is there something there to tap into, to bring forward, despite the kind of despondency post that when, it was a financialization scheme, depending if you believe that or not?
Well, I can tell you that, like, my first reaction was, like, fuck yes, finally. Finally, I've worked at galleries that sold digital files with a paper certificate of authenticity and a PDF. And for years, people are like, what do you mean you're selling a video on a USB drive? Like, what do I get, a USB drive? Do I get, is there a download? Is there a cloud link? Like, that's the artwork? What? And then, flash forward to 2021, and people are spending millions of dollars on JPEGs. I was like, finally, like, people have come to realize the value of things. People have come to realize that circulation value is more powerful than more traditional forms of value related to an artwork. And so that was unbelievably exciting for me, and to see, creators being supported. What troubled me about that moment, and what continues to trouble me, and I've spoken to a few people about this today, is the financialization of artwork as assets, and the consideration of artworks as investment assets rather than as artworks. And surely art has been used for that purpose forever, and I don't think we're under any misconceptions that it ever wasn't, but the way that became so blatant as a result of like burgeoning crypto economies was really stark and really dramatic. And I do some work in the Web3 space, and to this day I am in group chats where like people are literally just talking about the dollar value of their tokens, which are artworks, bespoke, beautiful, one-of-one artworks made by amazing creators, and that there's some kind of like abstraction from like both the labor and the artistic impulse, and then this output as a financial instrument that gives me some kind of pause, or isn't quite copacetic.
I think at the same time, that was very much a renaissance for artists to experiment with, like economic provocations, and to try and be pseudo institutions or their own economic systems, and to redefine value. So I feel that over those couple of years, I've seen some really exciting experiments, just because there was this like almost Trojan horse, or oh, I guess we could, but then it then those experiments actually open up some deeper conversation about what even is the value of money, you know, and where does it come from, and yeah, like what are we assigning it to?
I think what was most exciting for me about that time was like I saw many individual artists, but also like organizations start to like receive support in ways that they had never before. And one of the first things I did was think about like, well, how do I put this back into the ecosystem? Like I think about Processing Foundation, like really ramping up their fellowship program, right? Or like artists like Maya Mann, who like gave away percentages of her NFT sales to to support organizations like SFPC. That to me was like really exciting. That like as a like in a moment of like lots of money floating in our circles, that people were really again thinking about how do we resource ourselves collectively. Not everyone, of course, but there was like a good chunk of people who were doing that, and I think I felt like a lot of pressure to like be chips all in like on Web3 and NFTs kind of immediately. I was feeling that pressure a lot from board or stakeholders, and I'm so happy we didn't go all in, right? And instead said, let's lean into asking questions like we always do, and that I think, yielded a better outcome.
Yeah, I definitely was Chicken Little in that. I was like, oh no, because like capitalism. And so I think it was this kind of like, I loved the idea that we could ask new questions about value and how to resource and how to think about resource and how to think about provenance and how to think about like, again, this kind of modality of how are we sharing out cultural content. That felt really relevant to me. But then I started getting the question of, particularly from like foundation partners, like should we like convert some of our corpus to like NFTs? And I was like, no, you shouldn't. You wouldn't go to Vegas with it, right? And I think that was like hard for me to sort of, again, flash in on this idea that when you have institutions that only pay attention to conversations and technology on these like 10-year cycles that get lost in hype, that was what felt hard. Because they kind of did want to rush all in without actually having the savvy to ask better questions. Any other better questions in the audience? See how I did that? Oh, right, we've got one online, which I have to read. So we're talking a little bit about like open source and kind of originality and kind of copy and plagiarism and parodies. And I wonder, again, like, where do you sort of settle around this conversation of authenticity, like within the sort of digitalness?
I guess I'll speak first. I probably have the most like radical opinion of anyone, but I think that so much value is created from parodies, from copies, from all of these things. It's very rare that work is totally stolen and people don't know where it comes from. This goes again to media literacy. Like young people know they can go on, I see this all the time, again on TikTok. I see 11-year-olds seeing videos get reposted and they immediately know. They can look at the quality of the image. They can see something in the upper left-hand corner. It's obviously not the original and it's not the original posters. They can go to the account and they can see there's no history. So it's like these issues, I don't think, like there are certain problematic moments where they come to a head or like somebody's making money off of something that isn't theirs. But overall, I don't think that like there's many people who are like fully convincing people that work that they've stolen is theirs. Like I haven't seen it. I don't think it's happening very often. And I think that like there's really no, people have been copying artwork, stealing artworks forever. Like forgeries have of grand master paintings have always been a thing. Sure, it's more accelerated now, but I think that what we are seeing alongside of this is the valuation of the remix, of the parody, of the appropriation. I think this is something that was always like told to us in grad school that, in talking about the commons was that, every single $1 million Disney movie comes from something that's in the commons. They are completely creating value out of something that belongs to everyone, these classic stories and fairy tales. And I think that if people started to see it that way rather than, feel very closed off or feel like this is impacting their work in a negative way, I think that we would see a lot of cool stuff come into the world.
Just as an opposing anchor, maybe, I also really appreciate this idea of knowledge constellations or knowledge ancestors, which I think I have personally picked up on from Black theorists or academics or POC academics who are trying to be very intentional with uplifting, folks' work and voices that have traditionally been marginalized and, have been, taken from without proper credit. And those resources that are tied to that crediting do not always go back to those folks or those communities. So I think that's something that is really important as we think about just the practice of recognizing, as practitioners, where do our own ideas come from, where do our learnings come from, and how do we lay those breadcrumbs for other folks to be recognized or to be highlighted.
So we are almost at time. So I'm going to ask you guys to give one maybe concluding thought or idea. And it could be, since we asked what was hard, maybe I'll ask what's hopeful as a kind of rounding out thought. Anyone want to go first?
I'm really hopeful with screen fatigue. I think that post-pandemic, folks are like, okay, too much technology, what's actually going on? And it feels like an opportunity to recalibrate. Not to say let's throw all of our computers out, or on the other hand, let's embrace everything else that comes up, but really this kind of measured sort of approach and attitude that we're currently in. And I feel like in a lot of the interest that we've been getting with our class as a PC, I'm just noticing like more and more appetite for folks to get deeper into the transparency of our technology, where all of this stuff comes from, and what relationships we really want to have, what kind of world we really want to shape. And so really owning that question of technology together. I'm excited about that.
I'm really excited by some of the attempts, both failed and ongoing and maybe successful, to imagine new arts economies. Right now, I've been participating in a blockchain-enabled app called Farcaster, which there are certain, basically within, it's like a Twitter interface, but within it, you can tip artists. You can just write something as a reply, and then crypto assets go from your wallet to theirs automatically. And it's a really cool experiment to me in rethinking through redistribution of wealth and giving credit to the kind of daily labor of just existing on social media that artists are doing anyways. And so that has me really hopeful that not only artists who've always kind of understood the value of their work, but also collectors, and also just average consumers on the internet. Like, thinking about your average, person on X could, make somebody's, like, I like this like peer-to-peer exchange that's starting to happen and become more prevalent. I think it's pointing towards more equitable economies for the future.
I think I'm excited about the ways artists are forging new kinds of audience engagements via technology, and how that in turn is shifting how arts institutions or arts presenters are then relating to the communities they serve. And so I'm just excited for the spaces we visit all the time. They will look and feel very different in the near future.
Well, I'm very hopeful that we're getting to have these conversations and that artists are in the driving seat around this kind of like integration of technology into the arts, and that we're also able to model and build new economies for ourselves and with others. And I'm really grateful to the West Staff team for hosting this conversation today. So I just want to say thank you for that, and we will see you for our next sessions. Thanks so much.